How's it going? This is Read Aloud for October 5th, day 16. Go. Oops. Ooh, that wasn't good. Let me start over. That's not bad for a Monday. Here we go. Where were we? Oh, yeah, I remember now. Okay. Out of the frying pan and into the fire. It's a new chapter. Here we go. Bilbo had escaped the goblins, but he did not know where he was. He had lost his hood, cloak, food, pony, his buttons, and his friends. He wandered on and on till the sun began to sink westwards behind the mountains. Their shadows fell across Bilbo's path and he looked back. And then he looked forward and he could see before him only ridges and slopes falling towards lowlands and plains glimpsed occasionally between the trees. Good heavens, he explained, I seem to have got right to the other side of the misty mountains, right to the edge of the land beyond. Where, oh, where can Gandalf and the dwarves have got to? I only hope to goodness they are not still back there in the power of the goblins. He still wandered on, out of the little high valley, over its edge and down the slopes beyond, but all the while a very uncomfortable thought was growing inside him. He wondered whether he ought not, now he had the magic ring, to go back into the horrible, horrible tunnels and look for his friends. He had just made up his mind that it was his duty, that he must turn back, and very miserable he felt about it when he heard voices. He stopped and listened. It did not sound like goblins, so he crept forward carefully. He was on a stony path winding downward with a rocky wall on the left hand, and on the other side the ground sloped away, and there were dells beyond the level of the path, and there were dells below the level of the path overhung with bushes and low trees. It was one of these dells under the bushes were people talking. He crept still nearer, and suddenly he saw appearing between two boulders a head with a red hood on it. It was Balin doing lookout. He could have clapped and shouted for joy, but he did not. He had still got the ring on, and for fear of meeting something unexpected and unpleasant. And he saw that Balin was looking straight at him without noticing him. I'll give them all a surprise, he thought. As he crawled into the bushes at the edge of the dell, Gandalf was arguing with the dwarves. They were discussing all that had happened to them in the tunnels, and wondering and debating what they were going to do now. The dwarves were grumbling, and Gandalf was saying that they could not possibly go on their journey, leaving Mr. Baggins in the hands of the goblins, without trying to find out if he was alive or dead, and without trying to rescue him. After all, he is my friend, said the wizard, and not a bad little chap. I feel responsible for him. I wish to goodness you had not lost him. The dwarves wanted to know why he had ever been brought at all, why he could not stick to his friends and come along with them, and why the wizard had not chosen someone with more sense. He has been more trouble than use so far, said one. If we have to go back now into the abominable tunnels to look for him, then drat him, I say. Gandalf answered angrily, I brought him, and I don't bring things that are of no use. Either you help me to look for him, or I go and leave you here to get out of the mess as best you can for yourself. If we can only find him again, you will thank me before all is over. Whatever did you want to go and drop him for, Dory? You would have dropped him too, said Dory, if a goblin had suddenly grabbed your legs from behind in the dark, tripped up your feet, and kicked you in the back. Then why didn't you pick him up again? Good heavens, can you ask? Goblins fighting and biting in the dark, everybody falling over bodies and hitting one another. You nearly chopped off my head with Glamdring, and Thorn was stabbing here and there and everywhere with Orcust. All of a sudden, you gave one of your blinding flashes, and we saw goblins running back yelping. You shouted, follow me, everybody, and everybody ought to have followed. We thought everybody had. There was no time to count, as you know quite well, till we had dashed through the gate guards, out of the lower door, and helter-skelter down here. Here we are, without the burglar. Confiscate him. Confusticate. That's a weird word, confusticate. And here's the burglar. And here's the burglar, said Bilbo, stepping down into the middle of them and slipping off the ring. Bless me, how they jumped. Then they shouted with surprise and delight. Gandalf was as astonished as any of them, but probably more pleased than all the rest. He called to Balin and told him what he thought of a lookout man who let people walk right into them without warning. It is a fact that Bilbo's reputation went up a very great deal with the dwarves after this. If they had still doubted that he was really a first-class burglar, in spite of Gandalf's words, they doubted no longer. Balin was the most puzzled of all, but everyone said it was a very clever bit of work. Indeed, Bilbo was so pleased with their praise that he had just chuckled inside and said nothing whatever about the ring. And when they asked him how he did it, he said, "Oh, just crept along, very carefully, very quietly." Well, it is the first time that even a mouse has crept along carefully and quietly under my very nose and not been spotted, said Balin. And I take off my hood to you, which he did. Balin, at your service, he said. Your servant, Mr. Baggins, said Bilbo. And then they wanted to know all about his adventures after they had lost him, and he sat down and told them everything, except about finding of the ring. Not just now, he thought. They were particularly interested in the riddle competition, and shuddered most appreciatively at his description of Gollum. And then I couldn't think of any other question with him sitting beside me, ended Bilbo. So I said, "What's in my pocket?" And he couldn't guess it in 3 goes, so I said, "What about your promise? Show me the way out." But he came at me to kill me, and I ran and fell over, and he missed me in the dark. And then I followed him because I heard him talking to himself. He thought I really knew the way out, and so he was making for it. And then he sat down in the entrance, and I could not get by. So I jumped over him and escaped and ran down to the gate. What about the guards, they asked. Weren't there any? Oh yes, lots of them, but I dodged them. I got stuck in the door, which was only open a crack, and I lost a lot of buttons, he said sadly, looking at his torn clothes. But I squeezed through all right, and here I am. The dwarves looked at him with quite a new respect when he talked about dodging guards, jumping over Gollum, and squeezing through, as if it were not very difficult or very alarming. What did I tell you, said Gandalf, laughing. Mr. Baggins has more about him than you guess. He gave Bilbo a queer look from under his bushy eyebrows, and he said, as he said this, and the Hobbit wondered if he guessed at the part of his tale that he had left out. And then he had questions of his own to ask, for if Gandalf had explained it all by now to the dwarves, Bilbo had not heard it. He wanted to know how the wizard had turned up again, and where they had all got to now. The wizard, to tell the truth, never minded explaining his cleverness more than once. So now he told Bilbo that both he and Elrond had been well aware of the presence of evil goblins in that part of the mountains, but their main gate used to come out on different paths, one more easy to travel by, so that they often caught people benighted near their gates. Evidently, people had given up going that way, and the goblins must have opened their new entrance at the top of the pass, and the top of the pass the dwarves had taken quite recently, because it had been found quite safe up to now. I must see if I can find a more or less decent giant to block it up again, said Gandalf, or soon there will be no getting over the mountains at all. As soon as Gandalf had heard Bilbo's yell, he realized what had happened. In the flash which had killed the goblins that were grabbing him, he had nipped inside the crack just as it snapped to. He followed after the drivers and prisoners right to the edge of the great hall, and there he sat down and worked up the best magic he could in the shadows. A very ticklish business it was, he said, touch and go, but of course Gandalf had made a special study of bewitchments with fire and lights. Even the Hobbit had never forgotten the magic fireworks at old Took's Midsummer's Eve parties, as you remember. The rest we all know, except that Gandalf knew all about the back door, as the goblins called the lower gate, where Bilbo lost his buttons. As a matter of fact, it was well known to anybody who was acquainted with this part of the mountains. But it took a wizard to keep his head in the tunnels and guide them in the right direction. They made that gate ages ago, he said, partly for a way of escape, if they needed one, partly as a way out into the lands beyond, where they still come in the dark and do great damage. There, they guard it always, and no one has ever managed to block it up. They will guard it doubly after this, he laughed. All the others laughed too. After all, they had lost a good deal, but they had killed the great goblin and many others besides, and they had all escaped, so they might be said to have had the best of it so far. But the wizard called them to their senses. We must be getting going at once. Now we are a little rested, he said. They will be out after us in hundreds when night comes, and already shadows are lengthening. They can smell our footsteps for hours and hours after we have passed. We must be miles on before dusk. There will be a bit of a moon if it keeps fine, and that is lucky. Not that they mind the moon much, but it will give us a little light to steer by. Oh yes, he said in answer to the more questions from the Hobbit. You lose track of time inside goblin tunnels. Today's Thursday, and it was Monday night or Tuesday morning that we were captured. We've gone miles and miles and come right down through the heart of the mountain, and now on the other side. Quite a shortcut, but we are not at the point to which our past would have brought us. We are too far to the north and have some awkward country ahead, and we are still pretty high up. Let's get on. I am so dreadfully hungry, groaned Bilbo, who was suddenly aware that he had not had a meal since the night before last. Just think of that for a hobbit. His stomach felt all empty and loose and his legs all wobbly now that the excitement was over. Can't help it, said Gandalf, unless you go back and ask the goblins nicely to let you have your pony and your luggage. No, thank you, said Bilbo. Very well, then. We must tighten our belts and trudge on, or we shall be made into supper, and that will be much worse than having none ourselves. As they went on, Bilbo looked from side to side for something to eat, but the blackberries were still only in flower, and of course there were no nuts, not even hawthorn berries. He nibbled a bit of sorrel, and he drank from a small mountain stream that crossed the path, and he ate 3 wild strawberries that he found on its bank, but it was not much good. Okay, that's it for today. Thanks.